Over the past few years, I've met people from England, America, Australia, Germany, and Canada. Some of them were widows like me. Others had simply grown tired of living alone after retirement. Despite coming from different countries and living completely different lives, they all ended up making the same unexpected decision. They left places like Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and quietly started a new chapter in Indonesia. At first, I thought they all came for one reason: lower living costs. I couldn't have been more wrong. The more stories I heard, the more I realized that none of us were really chasing cheaper rent or lower grocery bills. We were searching for something much harder to find, a place where loneliness didn't follow us home. In this video, I'd like to share 3 retirement journeys, including my own, and by the end, you may understand why so many foreigners are quietly choosing Indonesia over some of Asia's most popular destinations. Because sometimes, the place that changes your life is the one you never expected to call home.
People often assume I moved to Indonesia because it was the cheapest option. They couldn't be more wrong. If money had been my only concern, I probably would have stayed where I was, at 68 years old, packing one suitcase and flying alone to a country where I didn't speak the language. Sounded completely irrational. My own children tried to change my mind. Friends told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Some even asked if I was having a late life crisis. Maybe they had a point, because just a few months earlier, I had been comparing retirement in Malaysia and the Philippines almost every single night. Both looked promising. Both seemed more affordable than my life back home. And for a while, I genuinely believed one of them would become my new home. But after months of planning, I walked away from both. Today, sitting on the shaded terrace of my small rented home in Indonesia, listening to scooters pass by while my neighbor calls out my name with a smile, I finally understand why. I wasn't searching for the cheapest country. I was searching for somewhere my life could begin again. Retirement wasn't supposed to feel this lonely. When I stopped working, everyone congratulated me. You've earned this. Now you can finally relax. But nobody talks about what happens when the routine disappears, when the phone stops ringing, when birthdays become quieter every year. My husband had been gone for 6 years. The house we'd spent decades building together suddenly felt far too large for one person. Every room held memories. Every evening ended in silence. Financially, things weren't much better. Inflation slowly chipped away at my retirement income. Healthcare costs kept climbing. Even grocery shopping became something I planned with a calculator. I wasn't living badly, but I was constantly worried. So I started researching retirement overseas. I joined Facebook groups, watched YouTube videos, read blogs written by retirees. Again and again, 2 countries kept appearing: Malaysia, the Philippines. For months, I convinced myself the answer had to be one of them. Malaysia impressed me immediately. Modern cities, excellent hospitals, comfortable apartments. Everything felt familiar, almost too familiar. When I added everything together, rent, healthcare, visas, groceries, transportation, I realized my monthly budget wasn't going to stretch nearly as far as I'd hoped. The Philippines pulled at my heart in a different way. The people seemed incredibly warm. English would make life easier. The beaches were breathtaking, but once again, reality looked different from the travel videos. The areas where I truly felt safe weren't cheap. Unexpected expenses kept appearing. Power costs, medical insurance, transportation. Every new calculation made my stomach sink. One evening, surrounded by pages of notes and retirement budgets, I closed my laptop and whispered to myself, maybe nowhere is meant for people like me. Then, almost by accident, I stumbled across stories of retirees quietly living in Indonesia. Not influencers, not luxury vloggers, just ordinary people living simple lives. Something about those stories felt different, less polished, more honest. Without overthinking it, I booked a flight. Looking back now, that was either the bravest decision I'd ever made or the most foolish. At the time, I honestly wasn't sure which. The first month was harder than I ever expected. I got lost almost every day. I couldn't understand menus. Simple errands took twice as long. Some nights, I questioned everything. I missed familiar food. I missed hearing conversations I could understand. Most of all, I missed feeling like I belonged somewhere. Then one afternoon, while walking back from the local market under the scorching sun, I suddenly felt dizzy. I sat down outside a tiny neighborhood shop, trying to catch my breath. Within moments, an elderly woman who owned the shop walked over. She didn't ask where I was from. She didn't ask why I was there. She simply brought me a chair, a bottle of cold water, and gently placed a small fan beside me. A younger man passing by helped translate. She kept smiling the entire time. Before I left, she pressed a few bananas into my hands. I reached for my wallet. She shook her head. No. The next morning, I walked past her shop again. She smiled as though she'd been expecting me. After that, it became a routine. Some mornings, we'd sit together in comfortable silence. Other mornings, her grandchildren would practice their English while laughing at my terrible Indonesian pronunciation. Soon, the fruit seller recognized me. The woman at the little cafe remembered exactly how I liked my coffee. Neighbors began waving before I even knew their names. Someone always seemed to ask, "Are you okay today?" If they didn't see me for a couple of days, they noticed. Not because I was a foreigner, because I had quietly become part of their neighborhood. That was the moment everything changed. For the first time since losing my husband, I stopped feeling like I was surviving life. I started participating in it again. People still ask if Indonesia is better than Malaysia or the Philippines. I always tell them they're asking the wrong question. This isn't about which country has the better infrastructure, or the faster internet, or even the lower cost of living. Those things matter, but only up to a point. What saved me wasn't cheaper rent. It wasn't affordable food. It wasn't the exchange rate. It was something I never thought I would find again at 68 years old: belonging. Today, my home is much smaller than the one I left behind. I own fewer things. My life is quieter, simpler. Some days, the power goes out. Traffic can still be chaotic. Nothing here is perfect. But every morning, someone greets me by name. Someone asks if I've eaten. Someone notices when I haven't stopped by for coffee. And that simple feeling is worth more than anything my retirement savings could ever buy. I came to Indonesia believing I was searching for a cheaper place to grow old. Instead, I found people who reminded me that growing old doesn't have to mean growing alone. Because I've learned something no retirement guide ever mentions. Home isn't the place where your money lasts the longest. Home is the place where your heart finally stops feeling like a visitor. And somehow, after 68 years of searching, I found that home in Indonesia. Sometimes people ask me if moving to Indonesia was the best decision I ever made. I always smile before answering, because the truth is, I didn't just find a country where my retirement money could go further. I found a place where I stopped feeling alone. And at 68 years old, that turned out to be worth more than anything money could ever buy. If my story meant something to you today, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories about retirement, new beginnings, and finding home in unexpected places, I hope you'll join me again for the next one.
A few months ago, I was having breakfast with another retired foreigner here in Indonesia. We had never met before. He pulled up a chair beside me, smiled, and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "So, what made you leave the other places and end up here?" For a moment, I just laughed, because the answer wasn't simple. If you had asked me 6 years ago where I planned to spend my retirement, Indonesia wouldn't even have made my list. Like so many people, I dreamed about the countries everyone talks about: Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines. Those names came up in every YouTube video, every retirement blog, every Facebook group where retirees debated which country offered the best value. Indonesia was barely mentioned. When it was, most people only talked about Bali. They assumed it was crowded, expensive, or only good for short vacations. I believed the same thing. But life has a funny way of proving our assumptions wrong. Today, at 68 years old, I wake up in Indonesia feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Not excitement, not luxury, not even adventure, just peace. And after meeting dozens of retirees from Europe, America, Australia, and Canada over the past few years, I've realized something. Many of them didn't come here because they were chasing the cheapest lifestyle. They came because they were searching for something they couldn't quite explain. Oddly enough, I think I was searching for the very same thing. Before moving overseas, my life had become incredibly small. I spent nearly 40 years working as an accountant in Birmingham. Numbers had always made sense to me. If something didn't add up, there was usually an explanation. Retirement was different. No spreadsheet could explain the silence that filled my home after my husband passed away 4 years earlier. We had shared that little brick house for more than 4 decades. Suddenly it felt far too large for one person. My son had built a life in Canada, while my daughter was raising 2 wonderful children in Australia. They called every week and reminded me that I could move closer to them if I wanted. But I didn't want to interrupt the lives they had worked so hard to build. So whenever they asked how I was doing, I smiled and gave the same answer: "I'm doing just fine." The truth was much quieter. Some afternoons, the only conversation I had was with the cashier at the supermarket. I wasn't looking for excitement anymore. I simply wanted to wake up somewhere that didn't remind me every single day of what I'd lost. Over the following year, I visited several countries across Southeast Asia. Every place had something wonderful to offer. Thailand felt energetic. Malaysia felt modern. The Philippines felt welcoming. Each destination gave me another reason to stay. Yet each time I boarded my flight home, something felt unfinished. I couldn't explain it. Nothing was actually wrong. The apartments were comfortable. The restaurants were excellent. The hospitals looked impressive. Public transportation was often better than what I had back home. On paper, everything seemed perfect. But whenever I imagined living there permanently, I couldn't picture my life beyond the apartment walls. I imagined grocery shopping, paying bills, walking the same streets every day, and somehow I still saw myself living as an outsider. Then a retired Australian I met during one of my trips asked me something unexpected. "Are you looking for a country, or are you looking for a life?" That question followed me everywhere. It stayed with me on flights, in hotel rooms, even back home in England. Eventually, curiosity led me to Indonesia. To be honest, I didn't arrive with high expectations. I thought I'd spend a couple of weeks, look around, then continue my search somewhere else. Instead, Indonesia quietly challenged almost everything I thought retirement was supposed to be. My first month wasn't particularly easy. There were moments when I questioned my decision almost every day. The weather felt hotter than I expected. Traffic seemed completely unpredictable. Simple errands often took much longer than they should have. I struggled with the language. Sometimes I accidentally ordered food I couldn't even recognize. Other days I smiled politely, without understanding a single word someone had just said to me. There were evenings when I returned to my rented house feeling exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Starting over at 68 wasn't nearly as romantic as social media made it look. One afternoon, I sat alone outside a small neighborhood cafe, wondering if I'd made another mistake. I wasn't looking at my phone. I wasn't reading. I was simply sitting there. A middle-aged Indonesian woman who owned the cafe noticed me. She walked over with a fresh cup of tea. I reached for my wallet. She gently shook her head. "No, welcome." Those 2 words stayed with me. The next day I came back. She remembered my name. A week later she introduced me to her husband, then to her sister, then to neighbors who stopped by every morning before work. Nobody asked what I owned. Nobody cared how much pension I received. Nobody treated me like a tourist they needed to impress. Instead, they included me in ordinary moments. One morning, I was invited to join a birthday breakfast for a neighbor's grandson. Another afternoon, someone insisted I take home fresh bananas from their garden. During a local celebration, families encouraged me to sit beside them even though I barely understood the conversations. Children laughed as they patiently corrected my pronunciation whenever I tried speaking Indonesian. Little by little, familiar faces replaced unfamiliar streets. The vegetable seller started putting aside my favorite tomatoes because she knew I'd arrive every Tuesday. The gentleman who repaired bicycles greeted me every morning with the same cheerful smile, even when I wasn't his customer. The security guard outside the neighborhood convenience store eventually stopped asking where I was from. Instead, he'd simply wave and ask if I'd already had breakfast. Those moments weren't dramatic. None of them would ever appear in a travel brochure. But together, they slowly changed how I felt. For the first time since losing my husband, I stopped counting the days. I started living them. People often assume foreigners are leaving popular retirement destinations because they're looking for somewhere cheaper. I used to believe that too. But after living here, I think the real answer is much simpler. As we grow older, our priorities quietly change. We stop chasing bigger houses. We stop worrying about impressing anyone. We begin looking for smaller things that somehow matter much more. A familiar smile. Someone who notices when you haven't stopped by for coffee. Neighbors who greet you by your name instead of calling you the foreign lady. Indonesia gave me those moments almost without trying. My home is smaller now. My wardrobe is simpler. I cook fewer meals than I used to. Yet my life feels fuller than it has in years. Looking back, I don't think people are quietly choosing Indonesia because it's perfect. They choose it because life here still leaves room for human connection. And at 68 years old, after losing the person I expected to grow old with, I discovered something that took me an entire lifetime to understand. Home isn't where you've lived the longest. It isn't where your passport was issued. It isn't where your pension stretches the furthest. Home is the place where people make you feel that your story isn't over yet. I came to Indonesia thinking I was beginning my retirement. Instead, I found the courage to begin living again.
People often ask me the same question. If Thailand is cheaper, why did you retire in Indonesia instead? 3 years ago, I probably couldn't have answered that. Back then, I thought retirement was about stretching my pension as far as possible. I spent weeks comparing apartments, visas, healthcare costs, YouTube videos, and Facebook groups filled with people arguing about which country was the better deal. Thailand always seemed to win. Better infrastructure, more expat communities, more restaurants, more conveniences. On paper, choosing Thailand looked like the obvious decision. But today, sitting on my small porch just outside Ubud, listening to the sound of roosters somewhere beyond the rice fields while my neighbor waves at me on his morning walk, I realize something. I wasn't searching for the cheapest retirement. I was searching for a place where I no longer felt invisible. And strangely enough, Indonesia gave me something no spreadsheet ever could. At 65, my life in Birmingham had become painfully predictable. My wife had passed away 4 years earlier after a long illness. The silence she left behind never really disappeared. My son lived in Canada. My daughter was busy raising her own family. They loved me. I never doubted that. But life has a way of pulling families in different directions. Every evening I ate dinner in front of the television. Every weekend looked exactly like the one before. I wasn't unhappy. I was simply existing. One rainy afternoon, I found myself watching videos of retirees living in Southeast Asia. Some were in Chiang Mai. Others were in Pattaya. A few had settled in Bali. For months I compared everything. Healthcare, rent, food, internet, safety, weather. Thailand kept coming out ahead. So I almost bought a condo there. In fact, I had already contacted an agent. Then something happened that changed everything. The real estate agent asked me a simple question. What kind of life are you hoping to build here? I stared at my computer screen and realized I had no answer. All I knew was that I wanted to escape loneliness, not just lower my expenses. That question stayed with me. Weeks later, I decided to visit both countries before making a final decision. Thailand impressed me immediately. Everything worked. Everything felt organized. The food was wonderful. The transportation was easy. The cities felt alive. But somehow, I still felt like I was watching life happen around me instead of being part of it. A few days later, I flew to Bali. The first week wasn't magical. It was humid. I got lost more than once. The traffic confused me. The mosquitoes seemed delighted to meet me. I even wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. One evening, I almost booked a flight back to England. I remember sitting outside my guest house thinking, what on earth am I doing here? The next morning, I decided to leave my guest house without any destination in mind. I simply walked. No map, no plan. Just following the narrow roads that wound through small houses, tiny temples, and rice fields glowing in the morning sun. After nearly 30 minutes, I found myself standing in front of a little, family-owned warung. It wasn't the kind of place tourists usually posted on Instagram. There were only 4 plastic tables, an old refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, a few handwritten menu items hanging on the wall. It looked ordinary, but for some reason, it felt welcoming. An elderly man stood behind the counter wearing a faded blue shirt and a warm smile. He greeted me with a cheerful "Selamat pagi." I smiled awkwardly. "Good morning." That was about all either of us understood. I pointed randomly at something on the menu. He chuckled softly and shook his head. Then he disappeared into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he returned, carrying a plate of nasi goreng, fresh fruit, and a cup of hot barley coffee. When I reached for my wallet, he gently raised his hand. "Later," he said with a smile. I sat there eating slowly while watching people come and go. Neighbors stopped by just to chat. School children waved as they walked past. Motorbike riders slowed down simply to say hello. It wasn't busy. It wasn't glamorous. But there was something about the place that made me want to stay. When I finally finished eating, the old man pulled out the empty chair beside mine. His daughter happened to speak a little English and helped us talk. He asked where I came from, how old I was, whether I had children. When I showed him a picture of my grandchildren, his face lit up. Without saying much, he pulled out his own phone and proudly showed me photos of his family. For a moment, it didn't matter that we lived on opposite sides of the world. We were simply 2 grandfathers, talking about the people we loved. Before I left, he smiled, pointed to the empty chair across from him, and said just one word: "Tomorrow." The next day I came back, then the day after that, and somehow returning became part of my routine. Every visit introduced me to someone new. The fruit seller next door learned I liked mangoes and always saved the sweetest ones for me. A young mechanic insisted on checking my scooter tires every few weeks because he worried about the foreign uncle. Children cycling home from school would shout, "Hello, Mr. David," before racing away laughing. One afternoon, the old man invited me to attend his granddaughter's birthday celebration. I almost declined. I didn't want to intrude. But he insisted. That evening I found myself sitting on a plastic chair, surrounded by 3 generations of one family. They laughed, shared food, passed plates around the table. Although I understood only bits and pieces of the conversation, I never once felt left out. Someone was always making sure my plate was full. Someone was always asking if I needed another drink. As I looked around the table, something unexpected happened. For the first time since my wife passed away, dinner no longer felt lonely, and I realized something. I hadn't been searching for a country. I'd been searching for people. People still ask if I regret not choosing Thailand. My answer is always the same. I don't think Thailand would have been the wrong choice. It simply wasn't the right choice for me. My house in Bali is smaller than the one I left behind in England. The roads aren't perfect. The power goes out once in a while. Life here certainly isn't flawless. But every morning, someone greets me by name. Someone asks how I'm doing. Someone notices if I haven't stopped by for coffee. Those little moments remind me that I'm no longer just passing through. Looking back now, I realize I spent months comparing countries by rent prices, healthcare, and cost of living. What I should have been comparing was something far more important. Where would I feel like I belonged? At 68, I've learned that retirement isn't about finding the cheapest place to live. It's about finding the place where your heart finally feels at home. I came to Indonesia thinking I was choosing a country. Instead, I found a community. And in the end, that made all the difference. I came to Indonesia thinking I was choosing a country. Instead, I found a community.